Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Actually, this is the first video of our channel, so a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for watching. And today I would like to speak with you about C4 model, why it's important, why we should have it in consideration, and why should you care about it. So C4 model is used to document and visualize software architecture. Today, currently, people do this in multiple ways, either using Dryo or ExcaliDraw or even, some version of UML. And that's okay. There are multiple approaches for doing so, but there's no, let's say, pattern to achieve documenting our architecture. And so that's what C4 tries to do in a simplistic way. Personally, I like the simplicity of C4 in contrast with the verbosity and lack of clarity that you might have with UML. But you do you, and you choose whatever tool fits best within your organization. Okay. So if you come to the home page on the documentation, you'll be presented with this diagram here. Okay. So this diagram showcases how each one of the components of C4, okay, each C stands for a specific thing in C4. So the one C is context, which is the first level, which we will speak, of course. Second level is containers. Third level is components, and fourth level is code. So as you can see from this image, let's zoom it a little bit. So whenever you are on a higher level, which is, for example, the case of context, whenever you go a level below, the only thing you're doing is just a zoom in. You get to see more details about the component that you want to analyze. For example, here we have our system, okay, more generic and general thing. Then I do a zoom in, I see the actual building blocks that our system has. In this case, they call it containers, and I can zoom in a container and see their individual components. And then if I zoom in on a specific component, I can see code. Okay, so the one thing I would like you to have in mind is that from one level to another, the only thing we're actually doing is zooming in and seeing more detail. Okay, so as probably you guess, the lower we go towards code, the lower level we are, therefore things can change quite a bit. So if you decide to go on a lower level, be sure that you actually want this, because things are more, let's say, dynamic and change a lot. Okay, so let's go out and see what each of these things actually mean in more detail. Okay, so if you go back to the documentation, you'll see that actually the documentation is pretty good. Okay, so I highly advise you to take a look at it with more detail, and besides this video, of course, and just see what they say here, because it's very, very good documentation. Okay, so when we start to speak about the context diagram, the thing that you should have in mind is that the context diagram, it tries to localize your software in its surrounding environment, let's say. Okay, so where does my software fit within a bigger picture? Okay, and also, so as you can see here, for example, this green box here is the software in question, so I can expand the image so that you can see with higher detail. So as I was saying, the context diagram, what it tries to do is to fit in your system within the bigger picture. Not only that, but also it showcases the dependencies, the external dependencies that your system has. For example, in this case, you have an email system. It could be an external payment provider like Stripe. Okay. So the point of this diagram is not to go into much detail, okay, as we saw previously. There are other ways to achieve detail, but the point of this diagram is to understand where our software fits, as I was saying, in a high level overview. Okay, so forget about detail, because we will achieve that with other levels, and think more about the high level overview. Okay, so this is what we want to achieve here. So whenever you're trying to design a diagram in level 1, you should have one question in the back of your mind that will help you to understand if you're designing this in the correct way. And the question is, can I show this diagram to non-technical people and they can completely understand this? If not, perhaps you might have some details that don't matter, like for example tech stack concerns. Am I using .NET, React, and so on? So this diagram should fit in within both technical and non-technical audiences. So have this principle in mind. Great. Now that we've seen what level 1 is, which is the context diagram, let's now go to level 2, which is containers. Okay. So if we come back to the documentation and we see what is written here, you'll quickly see that, as I showed you before, a container diagram is just a zoom in into our system. Okay, so remember that we are designing here the internet banking system, okay, as you can see here. So we have the internet banking system, level 1, high level overview. And if I zoom in into my container diagram, you'll see the inner building blocks that it has. Again, this is the level 2 container diagram. So zoom in into our context diagram. So as I said before, this container diagram is a zoom in into our base system, okay, from level 1, and you can clearly see the multiple components that make up your system. In this case, we have a web application, an SPA, a mobile app, an API application, and so on. So here you can see that those components, so the building blocks of your system, they communicate with each other, they depend on things, so you can clearly see those dependencies, those interactions, okay, on this level. Okay, so example of things that you can draw here. Normally, as stated in the documentation, what you'll have here is either things that run code, that execute code, like your API applications, your web apps, your SPAs, and so on, but also things that store data, like databases. Okay, so the author clearly states that those are, let's say, the two things that makes sense to expose here as well. Okay, so having said that, as you can see also in this diagram, we start to introduce more technical components, like the kind of programming language we will use. Is it Java, JavaScript, Xamarin? What kind of database we are going to enable, an Oracle database, for example. So as you can see, this diagram contains more technical lingo when you compare it, for example, with the context diagram, which means that the focus, the audience for this kind of diagrams is a more technical audience. Okay, so you should not be worried about can a non-technical person understand this diagram or not. This is not a concern. We are going technical, therefore our audience is technical. Okay, so that's one important thing you should note about this kind of diagram as well. So having watched level 2, now let's go to level 3, which is the component diagram. Okay, which, as I said before, the thing we are going to do now is choose a specific component that you have here, in this case a container, and zoom in into this building block to see the actual components it has. So if you go back to the documentation and you select the component diagram and we check the image, what you'll clearly see is that they chose to zoom in into the API application. So if you remember this bit here, so we decided to zoom in into this component, and what you can see here is the individual components that container had. Okay, so it has a sign-in controller, it has a reset password controller, and so on. Okay, so you can clearly see here the individual components that the container has. Okay, so and again, another thing you can see is not only those individual components, but also what kind of dependencies they have, interaction they have. For example, you see here that we have a security component that reads from a database. We have the reset password controller that uses the email component. So you can see the individual components, the interactions, the dependencies, and so on. Not only with internal things like a database, but also external systems like email system, payment, mainframe, and so on. Okay. So another thing that you'll notice here as well is that we go in a lower level in terms of technical details we introduce. In this case, I'm stating, okay, I'm using a MVC, Spring MVC controller, I'm using Spring Bean. So in terms of technicality, we obviously are going into a lower level, let's say. Okay, we are more technical and so on. Okay, and that's pretty much it about this kind of diagram, okay, the component diagram. Okay, you just zoom in into a container, see its individual components, and that's it. So having said that, we have finished exploring level 3, which is our component diagram, and now let's explore level 4, which is our code diagram. And as you can imagine and already guessed, what we'll do is to select a specific component and zoom in into this component to see the code that actually constitutes this component. Okay, so if we go back to the documentation and select diagram 4, okay, code diagram, and we zoom in on this picture, what you actually see is that it chose to go into the mainframe component, and you can see here the bits that constitute that component, almost like a class diagram of some sort. Okay, so what you'll clearly see here is that we are not enabling any kind of C4 notation here. We are using kind of a UML approach. So one of the things that you must be aware is that C4 actually doesn't have any notations on this. Okay, so you'll have to use another notation, as I said, UML, for example. But beware of something, is that most IDEs today can generate this diagram for you. Okay, so this means that you don't actually have to generate this diagram by yourself. You can just use, your IDE. Most likely than not, it will have some kind of support for this. I know that Visual Studio has, and I think Eclipse also has, plugins that you have that you can create this kind of diagrams. So don't create those yourself, please. It takes a while and things change a lot, so perhaps you would have to maintain those and change those frequently. So I would highly suggest you to enable these kind of tools to do the job for you. Okay, so yeah, so we've covered pretty much the 4 diagrams. Okay, so remembering, we started from a high-level overview, speaking about the context diagram, where we try to fit in our system within its environment, trying to fit in our system in the high-level overview in the big picture. Then we zoomed in on this system and saw the individual building blocks that compose our system. We call those individual building blocks containers. Okay, we saw the containers and we saw the interaction between the containers and the dependencies the containers had. Okay, Then we zoomed in a specific container, okay, and we saw the individual components that made that container. If you remember, we zoomed in into the API application. You saw the controllers, you saw the controllers, for example, you saw other components, how each controller enabled other components, and so on. Okay, then on the last step, which is the code diagram, you zoomed in into a specific component and you saw the code that made that component. So if you remember, we saw the mainframe code, and we told you that most of the tools today, they generate these kind of diagrams for you. You don't have to generate them yourself. Okay, so please have the tools do that for you. Enable the tools, okay? Now, as far as deciding which levels to enable, should I do the 4 levels or 3, or okay, what should be our decision? So people don't use, when designing architecture, they don't use the 4 levels, okay? And this is the thing I would like to tell you, is that this is not a one-size-fits-all, okay? So you need to check your company, whatever you guys do internally, so that you can make the best decision. What I'm going to tell you is what I've seen other people doing, and I do it myself, as far as what is the boundary between practicality and, I don't want to call it insanity, but let's call it insanity, okay? So in most cases I've seen the acceptance criteria for those kind of diagrams is only these 2 first levels here, okay? Context diagram and container diagram. Okay, they give you, or can give you, a good insight or visualization of what your architecture looks like. Okay, if you want to understand architecture, just by reading those 2 levels, you can get a clear understanding of what is my architecture, what are my dependencies, my interactions, and so on. Okay, so if you decide to go on a lower level, some people might argue that this isn't software architecture, this is more software design. It's a bigger discussion, it's a part of a bigger discussion, but that's not the point of this video. But my suggestion would be, if you want to communicate clearly about what your architecture is, and you want people to quickly understand what it is and what it does, I think you're most likely than not, you are good to go with these first 2 levels. Okay, so if you want to go perhaps on the component level or code level, keep in mind that those things change a lot, and perhaps the level of attention and care you need to have for those diagrams, they might increase. Okay, so that would be my high-level suggestion for you as far as communicating architecture. So now, having all of this theory provided to you, it's time for some code. Let's code some things out.